So now let me move to the final part of my talk. I want to build on the idea that we need urban forests, we need landscapes for our nature, for our health and well-being. Then there's different ways how we can do that, right? We can bring in all these different types of urban forests. Then the real question is, how do we do that? What are some of the key tools we have, some of the key concepts we can work with? So I often talk about these 12 C's. 12 C's that we can keep in mind as we develop our urban forestry and our urban greening projects. It's about connection, it's about collaboration, it's about, of course, realizing there's a community we work with, as well as a plant community that we have to respect. It's very much about communication, about communicating with residents and key stakeholders. It's about clarity in terms of having some clear objectives, clear targets that are easily understood by our community. It's about competence, of course. We need to have experts. We need to have people that are really good in developing green cities and designing landscapes like yourselves. People are really good in managing trees. People are also really good in understanding some of the planning implications. And we need to be creative, obviously. And I think I've shown you some really good examples of how we can be creative in bringing trees into the city. We also have to be courageous. So we have to sometimes take very bold steps. We will have a lot of resistance as we move forward, but we have to really move forward and keep pushing for these green agendas, because other fields, other professions, they will have economy, other benefits on their side. So we really have to make sure that we make our arguments strong. And there we need champions. We need people who are community leaders, who are well respected, who could be people from the local citizen groups. It could be politicians. It could also be stars or sports stars, etc., who are willing to bring this forward this message of more trees, please. We need, of course, funding. Nothing like this will happen if there's not at least some kind of resource behind it. And then finally, whenever we do this project, we have to be really clear about where are we, what is our context. The context of Mumbai will be very different from the context of Barcelona. That will be very different again from Vancouver. And also we have to realize there's an immense complexity when we deal with urban ecosystems, or even better, socio-ecological systems, where there's so many different people, so many different interests, so many different plants and animals. And of course, the whole political planning landscape around that as well is extremely complex. Let me briefly go through each of them. Connection is in a way, of course, about connecting us with trees. And of course, we're still very close to trees in many ways. We came from the trees and we still have trees in our lives for many different reasons. But it's also about realizing it's not just about a group of trees or a street with trees or a park or a forest. It's all really connected in one system, this green infrastructure or urban ecosystem. And it doesn't really make sense to isolate single trees and not recognizing they're part of this bigger whole. And it's also about collaborating. We often have to find new ways of collaborating. So the City of London in the UK did some really nice thing by declaring itself a national park city. And that seems a bit like a bit of a gimmick, right? But if you think a city has 52% or so of green space, a lot of very natural, historical, valuable green space, it's actually a very clever way of trying to assemble interest, investment, political attention, community attention for the local parks. So when the mayor of London declared a city like this, it was actually probably a good move forward for the green infrastructure of London. The community comes first. Whatever we do as designers, as managers, we're always designing and managing for our clients, for the community. And that, of course, means that we have to reflect on who our community is. Who are the people who are going to use this park? And actually, how are they going to shape it? Because we design and we plan and we manage. But in the end, it's the users that really give spirit to the park and make it function well. And they also have to claim some kind of ownership over it. Communication is, of course, key as well. And communication comes in many forms, in the way that I do it now, but of course it comes also in the books we read. Novels like The Overstory, a great book by an American writer called Richard Powers, that talks about the many different links between people and forests and how forests percolate our lives. But also the really excellent book by Adini Nagendra and her colleague Mundoli on cities and canopies and trees in Indian cities. So I have to admit, I know very little about Indian urban forestry and Indian trees, but by reading this book, I really started feeling that some of this came alive, some of these really nice stories about how Indian cultures interact with trees and what trees mean for people in India as well. So I'm sure many of you have read it. If you haven't read it, highly recommendable. Clarity then is really key. So one of the things you can have clear, for example, canopy targets. So you say, hey, this city wants to have at least 20 or 30% canopy cover, which then can be associated with different ecosystem services. And clarity is good, of course, for example, policymakers, politicians. They like to have clear targets that can be measurable. It can be used also to show, for example, that we've been losing trees over time. I said it can be related to some of the benefits as well, but there are some downsides to it. So sometimes some of these canopy targets are simply too simplistic. If we say 30% canopy cover, well, actually we can have maybe 60% in one part of the city and less than 10% in another. That's probably not what we want either. So we always have to have a nuanced view of these kind of targets and think a little bit about distribution issues. Like you see here the map of Vancouver in the right bottom, where you see quite clear differences in the west of the city, which is pretty well off, right, where most of the well-off people live, and then you move east where poorer people live, you see also there are less trees there. And unfortunately, these patterns are known for many cities in the world. It's about quality as well. Of course, it's not only about square meters of green, it's about also what these green spaces give us in terms of quality and functionality. Competence is key. I'm really happy that I'm involved at UBC in this new master program where we try to educate people for urban forestry leadership. So people will take about a 1 year online program where they learn about urban forestry, they learn about associated fields like landscape design and geomatics, but they especially learn a lot about things like leadership, project management, entrepreneurship. So they kind of create a skill base that will bring them into a position where they will be really well placed to lead interdisciplinary greening teams in cities, but maybe even in NGOs or in national governments. Of course, we need to be creative. I gave you many examples of that, and it could be anything from creating a very different kind of urban forest in a car or on a car, talking about these nature-based solutions, but also communicating our plans, our urban forest strategies in nice ways that people can visually easily relate to that. So creativity, and I know I'm preaching to the confessed because I know many landscape designers, landscape architects, you're extremely creative in your work and you're very visual in your work. I think we really need it as we move green cities forward, because it's all about, of course, being visual these days. People have to really see the picture in front of them rather than maybe reading a long report or plan. And courage. Some cases, politicians have been very courageous, like here in Seoul, in Korea, where Mayor Lee Myung-bak, he was asked by his highway engineers to create another layer on top of this highway that was going straight to the city. So we had 3-story, I think 8-lane or 10-lane highway. But he actually took a very radical decision, said, no, let's remove the whole highway. We're going to redirect the traffic and we're going to daylight the river. We're going to create a new park, which has now become extremely popular green space in Seoul. Very bold move. It paid off for him because he actually eventually became president of Korea. There were some issues after that in terms of some corruption case, I think. I will not go into that. But at least he made some really strong and courageous decisions for green spaces in the capital. Money is important, right? You have projects like this. This is Fudao Greenway project in Fuzhou, Fujian province, China, where I have a guest professorship. And one of the things that they did there is they made this kind of nice overpass system. So people can actually experience a local urban forest from above. They can experience the canopies, the birds, etc. And of course, these are multi-million-dollar projects. It's free for the residents. But of course, sometimes these investments are really paying off because you get this really strong connection between people and urban forests. And then finally, context and complexity. Of course, context is really important. So when I worked in Vancouver in British Columbia, there was a lot of focus on indigenous populations, on First Nations, and their traditional stewardship of the land. So the city, Vancouver, urban forest, they're all created actually. They're all based on former First Nations land. So how can we bring some of that land stewardship back? How can we bring in some of those traditional, respectful ways of dealing with the land? So we hope, of course, to get many indigenous students in our forestry and urban forestry programs, because that actually is the best way forward, because people like that will understand their own communities better than other people would do. And complexity then, of course, is also key. And one of the concepts that I work with quite a bit is biocultural diversity. So not just biodiversity and diversity of species, but also cultural diversity, and recognizing that we deal with multicultural societies, like you have in India. Cities are very diverse. People come from many different backgrounds. A city like Vancouver as actually the majority of its people speak another language than English as their first language. So we have to relate that because people shape, experience green spaces and nature in their own way. So we have to integrate that as we move forward with our urban forestry approaches. I've come to the end of my talk, and I'm really appreciative of you listening to me. I hope I've shown you some nice international examples and also given you a little bit of inspiration of actually the really good time that we're in. Of course, it's challenging. We've all been really challenged by the pandemic. We know climate change is really a big struggle. There's issues with poverty alleviation. There's issues with biodiversity loss. But I think this is the time when actually green spaces are starting to be taken more and more seriously. They're crucial for our health, for our resilience. So we need to be more strategic, more proactive. We need to be sometimes more opportunistic as well. And actually, I'm starting to work with this new guideline, which over all my years of work, often I get asked, like, can you give us some guideline? What is the canopy cover? What is the number of green spaces? What is the share of green spaces we should have in our city? And I've always been very hesitant, but I realized for politicians, it could actually be good to have some kind of guidance. So I now say, let's use the 3-30-300 rule. Everybody should, from their house or their dwelling or apartment, have the view of at least 3 trees. Because then we know having visual access to trees is one of the main reasons to promote mental well-being. And we've seen it in the COVID pandemic. And of course, you can say 1 tree, but a little bit of diversity actually we know is also extremely good for our well-being. Then we need at least 30% canopy cover in each neighborhood. And that's not to say that cities cannot have more ambitious canopy cover. But we know with 30%, we get really good benefits in terms of climate change. We start having meeting places. People are more encouraged to go to the street, etc. And then finally, nobody should be further away than 300 meters from the nearest larger green space. And it could be a 1 hectare pocket park or something like that. A space at least that allows for some kind of recreational activity. So 3-30-300. And if we start using that model, we work together as landscape architects, urban foresters, planners, then I think there could be a very bright future ahead of us for our cities. Thank you for listening.